As conflicts erupt the world over, it's no surprise to see the global arms trade jumping significantly in the last 5 years. And the recipient countries are in highly volatile places, prompting the question, why do supplier countries keep fueling these crises? The business of weapons, supply, demand, maybe even morals. This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Kamal Santamaria. You know, you can illustrate the effect of arms and weapons any number of ways. But in the end, there is no substitute for a real on-the-ground conflict to see just how much of an impact they have. Sri Lanka, it's in the news a lot these days because over 6,500 civilians have been killed in recent fighting there, around 13,000 injured, more than 113,000 displaced. And none of this would have happened without the global arms trade. The Sri Lankan government, in fact, increased its arms imports between 2004 and 2008. And as its stockpile grew, so too did its military assaults on the Tamil Tigers, the LTTE. The government's determined to destroy the LTTE and claims it's almost wiped it out, apparently by stopping the flow of arms to Tamil Tiger fighters, but of course also by government troops having access to so much more arms. And the same is true the world over. According to a recent report from SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the whole world arms trade has increased by 20% in just the last 5 years. And when you break it down into the regions, you really get to see A, where the military might is, but B, more importantly, where it's going. Have a look at this. These are the exporting arms countries. First of all, no surprise, the US exports more arms than any other single country. Europe collectively exports around 58%. That includes Russia, which is on its own 25% of world arms exports. But look at where it's all going, because this has changed a lot in the last 5 years. Asia receiving 37% of the world's arms. Sri Lanka, of course, China, South Korea as well. Europe takes 24%, the Middle East 18%, leaving the Americas, Africa and other nations regions importing the least. I want to go back to those Middle East figures though, because it's kind of hard to ignore the staggering increase in imports to the region. 38% higher in the last 4 years. 34% of that, so we're talking a third of exports went to the United Arab Emirates alone, making it the third largest recipient in the world and probably a significant importer in years to come, which is all a bit odd really, considering the UAE isn't at war with anyone and has pretty good relations with all its neighbours. The second largest recipient in the region, not surprisingly, Israel 22%, Egypt has 14%. And despite significant speculation about Iran's arms import plans, it accounted for only 5% of transfers to the Middle East. Lots of numbers to talk through, lots of ideas to talk through with our two guests today. In Stockholm is Paul Holtom. He is the head of the arms transfer program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, and in London is Rebecca Peters. She is the director of the International Action Network on Small Arms. My thanks to both of you for joining us on Inside Story. Paul Holtom, I'll come to you first in Stockholm. Let's deal with the Middle East, because we've been just talking about that most recently, and specifically the United Arab Emirates. What on earth is going on there? 80 F-16 jets from the US, 50 Mirage jets from France, from 16 to third highest in the whole world. What does the UAE need all that firepower for?
Thank you, Kamal. Well, I think what we're seeing is here sort of the UAE upgrading and modernising at a time of an economic boom, benefiting from high oil prices, and also benefiting from being a key ally of the US in the region. The US has significantly increased its military aid to the region in recent years, especially under the Bush administration, and I think we're seeing the fruits of that at the moment.
So it's just stockpiling, you think? There's no particular reason behind this? The reason I stay with it is just because it's just such an extraordinary number. As we said, for a pretty quiet country, most people associate the UAE with tourism, with oil, with things like that, not with being a military superpower of the Middle East.
Sure. I mean, it's basically, there's a huge upgrading in the last 5 to 10 years, we could say. Obviously with an eye towards Iran. It seems to be that the US and the UAE and a number of Gulf Cooperation Council states share some concerns about a possible retaliation, not necessarily provoking Iran in this case, but there's concerns that if Iran does strike, then they would be amongst those who would be sort of in the first line, I guess. We've seen that Saudi Arabia, which was one of the third largest arms imports in the 1990s, has sort of dropped much down our rankings. but it's another case where we expect them to also rise significantly in the coming years. So we're really sort of pointing at the UAE, but also I think broader trends in the region.
And you mentioned Iran there, the irony being that Iran's only accounting for, I think we said 5% of Middle East imports, a very, very small amount compared to any other country.
Indeed. I mean, I think it's also worth throwing in that although not subject to a UN arms embargo, there have been sort of calls in UN Security Council resolutions for restraint to be exercised. And we also see Russia still in discussions with Iran on the supply of surface-to-air missiles, and also China. It also has its own arms industry, of course.
Let's bring in Rebecca Peters in London for her opinion, and we'll stay again with the Middle East. I think there's just a lot to talk about here. Some more numbers from the SIPRI report. 37% of US exports go to the Middle East. 40% of French exports go to the Middle East. And these are two countries, and I would put France in with sort of a group of being the European Union. Two groups trying to show that they want to bring peace to the Middle East. It's all ironic, it's diametrically opposed. It just doesn't, in some respects, doesn't even make sense that they're supplying all these arms to a region where they want peace.
Well, you're right, Kamal. I mean, this story is full of ironies or contradictions or paradoxes, and unfortunately, the result is really, really dangerous. When countries begin to stockpile arms because they believe that they're in danger, they don't actually increase their own security. They increase the insecurity in the region. So whether it's an increase in weapons going to UAE, U.S. weapons going to the region, or French weapons going to the region, that is a region which is extremely tense. And which is in itself has conflict and potential for conflict. And another aspect of the thing is that when you have an increase in weapons because a country is upgrading, for example, there's a run-on effect. So usually when a country upgrades its weapon supply, it sells the old weapons to another country, a poorer country, which perhaps couldn't afford to buy the most modern ones. And then that country is upgrading, that's an upgrade, and they sell their old weapons on. And so wherever we see an increase in arms transfers, there's going to be a bit later an associated increase in danger for other countries as well. The whole thing is really, and especially at a time when there are so many other needs to be met in the world, and where unfortunately there are so many human rights abuses, violations of international humanitarian law being committed, particularly in that region. The whole thing really is very, very sad and worrying news. Yeah,
we're going to look at that humanitarian issue a little bit later in the show. If I can play devil's advocate for a moment, that's my job here as a moderator. Suppliers, I mean, we're looking at all these suppliers who are sending out or selling arms to all these countries. Supply is dictated by demand. The demand is there, and I guess these countries would just say these are business transactions and they're going to carry on regardless.
Well, yes, and that's one of the problems at the moment, that virtually the only thing regulating the international supply of conventional weapons at the moment is demand. But these are not products like, you know, televisions or refrigerators. These are products that are designed specifically for killing large numbers of people and doing a lot of damage to infrastructure, to doing a lot of damage to governments and societies. It's unbelievable that we have left the regulation of this market to be basically only subject to demand.
But bottom line is,
international rules on that.
Bottom line is these products, if we can call them that, they bring in more money than refrigerators or televisions, don't they? Isn't that the bottom line in this? Especially with a global economic crisis going on, you've got to bring in as much money as you can.
Indeed. Indeed, bringing in money is obviously the big priority for the countries that are selling these weapons, and but it's very short-sighted on their part, because very often the countries that are selling the weapons are also big contributors to international aid, and so the damage that is done by these weapons in terms of contributing to humanitarian crises, causing refugee problems, destruction of infrastructure, it's the same, many times the same countries in their donor aid programs that have to then patch up the damage.
Paul Holtham, in Stockholm, when you put together a report like this, I mean, I've read the whole report and it's very measured. It just gives the details as they are, the facts of who's increased and who's decreased. Does the Stockholm SIPRI, I guess, sorry, as it's called, does it take into account morals and issues like that? I mean, the whole idea of the type of stuff that Rebecca's been talking to us about, the fact that this is not just trading in regular products, this is trading in death in the end.
Certainly. I mean, we were set up in the late 1960s with a view to sort of providing objective information on the arms transfers to inform international discussions, debates, and also national discussions within particular countries on whether, as Rebecca was saying, it's responsible of a country to supply weapons to regions of tension or conflict. We do provide objective analysis as well, we believe, on these figures and on the concerns that we raise. And in the report itself, I think we draw attention to a number of countries that we feel are of concern when it comes to imports of weapons, not necessarily that in the top 5 or the top 10, but countries where we see there's been an increase in the flow of arms in recent years, and in some cases a correlation with the outbreak of a conflict. Georgia is one of the cases, I think, that we would highlight in this respect. In the period 2004 to 2008, SIPRI showed that Georgia had imported 4 times more weapons in this period than in the late Shevardnadze period. And of course, we know what happened in August of 2008 when the military option was chosen as a means of settling the South Ossetia conflict.
Just a reminder, you're watching Inside Story, where we are discussing the global arms trade, and in particular, a report which has shown just how much that trade has increased in the last few years. Our guests for today, Paul Holtom, who's author of the SIPRI report on global arms trade. He's in Stockholm. And in London is Rebecca Peters from the International Action Network on Small Arms. Folks, we've discussed numbers, percentages, the increase in arms trade. I think we should really look closer at the results of those things, namely conflict, war, and death. Now, we are going to use more numbers to illustrate this, but what we're trying to do here is paint more of a humanitarian picture to the arms trade. Start with the Darfur crisis in Sudan, where the United Nations says up to 300,000 people have died since 2003 from the combined effects of war, famine and disease. We talk about the long-standing issue between India and Pakistan over Kashmir, which has claimed more than 60,000 lives in the last 20 years. More recently, of course, Israel's war on Gaza. It killed more than 1,300 Palestinians, wounded around 4,500 others. That was just in 3 weeks. And then 2 ongoing issues which we know about, Afghanistan and Iraq. No definitive official figures for Afghanistan, but the UN assistance mission there reports at least 2,000 civilians killed by armed conflict in 2008 alone. That year, the highest number since the end of the invasion in 2001. Iraq, of course, claiming at least 85,000 lives in the last 4 years. Those numbers coming from the Iraqi government. Let's go back to Rebecca Peters in London. She's from the International Action Network on small arms. Again, I'm going to play devil's advocate. I'm going to be a bit negative here and actually say all those numbers which I just listed, and we could carry on for hours listing those sorts of numbers. Do they mean anything in the end? I said it before, these are business transactions, one country selling arms to another, and they're not going to stop these transactions just because people are dying in wars, because if that was the case, it would have stopped already by now.
Well, it's true that they are seen very much as business transactions, but nowadays, I mean, as the world has become smaller, with increasing globalization and increasingly an effort to work together and for countries to be able to reach to affect each other's behavior, actually, whether in the pursuit of commercial goals or political goals or others, we have it's not acceptable anymore for other countries to stand by and watch arms exporting countries just say, well, we're making a lot of money, so it doesn't matter what the results are or how many people die. It's going to be, of course, very difficult to convince the arms exporting countries themselves that they should reduce their arms exports because, as you say, they're making a lot of money. But what we hope to do is to put pressure on them through the other countries of the world, the countries that are suffering the impact of these weapons, and also other developed countries which are perhaps not suffering the impact directly, but which are having to cope with the consequences in terms of the international humanitarian and development problems that result, and trying to create pressure for some kind of global international regulation, some kind of treaty to at least say that when arms transfers are irresponsible, if they're going to be used in severe violations of human rights or international law, that those transfers should be prohibited. And it is ambitious. You're right. Money talks. Money is a big factor in the world. But you know, it's we don't believe that all countries are completely amoral immune to the humanitarian consequences of this trade.
So Rebecca Peters there talks about countries that are suffering the impact of weapons. Paul, if I can come back to you in Stockholm, just to go back to the report, have you seen any particular increase in weapons going to actual conflict zones, like all those ones I just mentioned, like Sri Lanka, which was the example we used at the top of the show?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of our data, although we see a lot of conflicts obviously fought with small arms and light weapons, I think there are some correlations with the deliveries of the major conventional weapons that we look at. Sri Lanka, for one, increased significantly in 2008, the volume of deliveries of major conventional weapons. Georgia, as I just mentioned before, was another case where we saw that correlation. And even in countries in Africa, such as Chad, the Central African Republic and Sudan, we also see these correlations. In particular, I think it's interesting that the import of one or two armed helicopters can have a significant impact in terms of the conflict in these cases as well. And I think that we sort of try and show that in our data.
Yeah, Sri Lanka's interesting actually. Have a listen to these figures which I've got here. For the whole year, this has come out of the British government actually. For the whole year of 2007, the UK exported $1.5 million worth of arms to Sri Lanka. That's for the whole year. For just the last quarter of last year, it was $2 million worth as the conflict increased. Now, admittedly, it was mainly communications equipment, but, whether you believe it's the good guys or the bad guys, the government or the Tamil Tigers, it's fueling a conflict.
The same with China also, which has been a major supplier in recent years of combat aircraft. Pakistan has provided military aid and ammunition, and we've also seen India supplying air surveillance equipment in relation to LTTE air attacks. So you're seeing, like you said, a lot of equipment going in recent years, which obviously correlates quite strongly with the increase in the Sri Lankan army's efforts.
Rebecca, did you want to say something there?
Oh, just that in Sri Lanka, as in so many other parts of the world as well, we know that very often those weapons are not looked after, kept secure, or in fact necessarily defended very well by the governments that buy them. And government stockpiles are a major source of weapons that come into the hands of rebel groups and other non-state actors. And that's another, of course, part of the reason for the continuing demand is that governments lose control of their weapons. They then are in the hands of other groups, and that's something where really the exporters could have some impact on. They could say, look, the weapons we sold you before, you haven't retained control of, so we're not going to sell you anymore. It's part of, it's not just about like the good guys accumulating weapons and stomping out the bad guys. It's unfortunately the bad guys are often very, very clever as well.
Let's look at some ideas then about, if I can use this word, solutions. I don't think this is a problem you can actually solve so much, but there are calls for an arms trade treaty, though I've read votes in the UN General Assembly of plenty of abstentions, the US voting against it. Is it, Rebecca, I'll stay with you on this one, is it, sorry to be negative again, is it a losing battle, really? Are you ever going to be able to push through something like an arms trade treaty?
Well, it's as you'd imagine, it's very difficult to try to battle against the arms industry, the major arms producers, especially when, as you've pointed out, it's so much they get economic benefit from it. But that's one of the reasons why the United Nations was created. The reason the United Nations was created was to increase global security, and bringing the arms trade under control has to be an essential part of that. Availability of weapons doesn't cause conflict, but it makes it much more likely that a conflict will become violent, that it makes a conflict likely to last longer. It increases the number of people likely to be killed, injured, displaced, become homeless, get diseases in a conflict. So the supply of weapons is a major, major component in maintaining an insecure world. What we've seen in the UN when there's been the votes in relation to beginning work on an arms trade treaty, the US has voted against it, although with the new administration in the US, we're very hopeful that we might see the US joining with the rest of the world to recognize the need for the arms trade treaty. But getting back to the original region we talked about, the Middle East has also been, they haven't actually voted no, but they've abstained and made comments in the UN. Most of the Middle East, the Arab League states, have made comments suggesting that they are not in favor of an arms trade treaty. An exception, by the way, is Morocco. Morocco, Lebanon, Jordan, for example, have been supportive of it. And yet, really, the Middle East, it it's one of the regions most affected by actual or potential armed conflict, and as we see arms imports, especially increasing to the Middle East, it's all the more important that the Middle East get behind a treaty to make sure that these weapons that are coming in such large numbers into the region are not going to be used in human rights or international humanitarian law violations.
Paul Holton, what do you think about the reasons for the Middle East holding out so much on this? Is it, if I can coin a phrase, a history of violence, the fact that they're almost wedded to, well, they've been through so much violence on so many fronts that it's part of the psyche almost?
Well, I was going to intervene and say that sort of we had efforts in the early 1990s on the back of the conflict in Iraq, whereby the permanent members of the Security Council issued and agreed amongst themselves guidelines to exercise restraint in terms of arms transfers to the region, to prevent destabilising accumulations, to prevent potential for future conflict. We've also had efforts at that time to promote transparency in arms transfers, and in these issues we've had problems, of course, from the recipients in the Middle East not fully participating, linking the issue with nuclear weapons. And I think one of the things with the Arms Trade Treaty which I find quite interesting is, as it says, it's to sort of monitor the trade and control the trade, in contrast to things on nuclear weapons, chemical and biological, where you have a prohibition. I think this is what makes it a far more complex issue, but nevertheless a still important one, of course. Yeah,
but again, it's the paradox. You mentioned that Iraq example with the Security Council. I mean, 4 of the 5 top exporters are permanent members of the Security Council, a body which is supposed to promote peace and use the idea of sanctions and pressure before war, and yet they're the ones selling all the guns.
Indeed, it is a very difficult position. And we see, for example, in the 1990s, the heyday of arms embargoes being imposed with agreement between the P5, the permanent members of the Security Council, on the targets in West Africa and other African conflicts. And we're seeing sort of a less and less willingness, I suppose, and less agreement between those to impose arms embargoes. And yet they are, at the moment, the only international legally binding prohibitions on the supply of arms to particular actors, whether they be states or rebel groups.
Folks, we're almost out of time. I'm just going to bring you one more little thing which I just collected today in my research, something which came from the former US President Dwight D. Eisenhower 56 years ago. I'm quoting him. He said, "Every gun that's made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies a theft from those who have hunger. They're not fed, the ones who are cold and who are not clothed. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron." Interesting that that would come out 56 years ago and still holds so true today with everything that we've spoken about. My thanks to Paul Holton from SIPRI joining us from Stockholm, and also Rebecca Peters from the International Action Network on Small Arms. She was in London for us. Thanks for your thoughts today, and thank you to you, our viewers, for joining us for Inside Story. You know, you can always send comments on this show or suggestions for a future show. You can send them to that email address there, insidestory@aljazeera.net. From the whole team, it's goodbye for now.